The Galactic Empire wasn't brought down by the rebellion alone. It was rotting from the inside, staffed by officers so corrupt and incompetent, they did more damage than any X-Wing ever could. Today I'm breaking down the most corrupt Imperial officers in Star Wars, starting with a guy who had no business commanding a Star Destroyer, Admiral Cassius Constantine. Cassius Constantine is what happens when you promote someone based entirely on who they know rather than what they know. And what he knew was absolutely nothing about commanding a fleet. This guy climbed through Imperial ranks on political connections alone. Merit didn't matter. Competence didn't matter. Knowing the right people at the right cocktail party. That's your fast track to Admiral. Here's the thing. Constantine repeatedly lost engagements against rebel forces that were smaller, less equipped, and running on fumes. His response to getting outmaneuvered wasn't to rethink strategy. It was to throw more bodies at the problem. Entire fighter squadrons gone. All so he could delay the inevitable moment someone noticed he was terrible at his job. And when those failures stacked up, zero self-reflection. Every desperate gamble was designed to do exactly one thing: keep Constantine employed for another week. His crews were expendable. His pilots were expendable. The only thing that wasn't expendable was his career. But if Constantine represents the Empire's rot at the bottom of the barrel, wait until you meet the guy who mouthed off to Darth Vader about the Death Star. Admiral Conan Antonio Motti. This is the guy who looked Darth Vader in the face and told him the Force was basically a fairy tale. To Darth Vader, the man who can crush your windpipe with a thought. Bold strategy. But Motti's arrogance wasn't just a personality flaw, it was his entire operating system. He didn't just work on the Death Star, he worshipped it. To him, that battle station wasn't a weapon. It was proof that the Empire had evolved beyond anything as primitive as the Force. Technology was his religion, and the Death Star was his god. Here's where it gets dark. That same technological obsession meant he viewed his own crew as interchangeable parts. Enlisted personnel weren't people, they were components. He allocated minimal resources to crew welfare, prioritized efficiency over safety, and generally treated thousands of living beings like firmware updates. If the machine worked, nothing else mattered. And then the machine didn't work. Motti almost certainly died aboard the first Death Star when a single proton torpedo proved his entire worldview wrong in about 4 seconds, destroyed by the very thing he placed his absolute faith in, killed by a threat he literally mocked to a Sith Lord's face, which is, not ideal. But at least Motti's corruption was limited to one station. The next officer spread his rot across an entire region, off Jerjerrod. Every empire has its grand villains, the ones who scheme for galactic domination and choke subordinates across conference tables. And then there's Moff Jerjerrod, who just wanted to finish a construction project on time and not get murdered by his boss. Jerjerrod was the commanding officer of the second Death Star, which sounds impressive until you realize his entire job was being a project manager for a moon-sized superweapon while Darth Vader breathed down his neck. His very first scene is Vader telling him the Emperor is displeased with his progress. Jerjerrod's response is basically sweating and promising to double his efforts, which is, not ideal. Here's the thing, Jerjerrod wasn't incompetent. He was building the most complex battle station in galactic history with finite resources and an enslaved workforce. But the Emperor wanted it done faster, and Vader's idea of a performance review involved implied death threats. Everyone above him was terrifying, so every day was just survival. That's not leadership. That's a guy trying not to become a cautionary tale. His end was fittingly unceremonious. He went up with the Death Star at Endor. The galaxy barely noticed one more officer vanishing in that explosion, which tells you everything about how disposable Imperial middle management really was. But if Jerjerrod represents the Empire's most forgettable bureaucracy, the next officer proves that even the competent ones weren't safe from the system that created them. Admiral Firmus Piet. Piet is the kind of officer that should genuinely terrify you, not because he was cruel, not because he was fanatical, but because he was good at his job and simply did not care what that job required. The man possessed real tactical competence. He could command a fleet, read a battlefield, and adapt under pressure. That's exactly what makes his moral bankruptcy worse than someone like Motti's. Piet understood the full scope of what the Empire demanded, and he chose it anyway. No hesitation, no internal conflict, just a career trajectory pointing upward. He oversaw operations that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians with the emotional engagement of someone reviewing quarterly reports. Mass atrocity wasn't something Payette wrestled with. It was Tuesday. You clock in, you facilitate the destruction of a settlement, you file the paperwork. He required zero ideological justification, no speeches about galactic order, just promotions, which is, not ideal. And somehow this man served directly under Darth Vader and survived. Vader, who executed admirals the way most people change socks. Payette watched his predecessor get force-choked to death, stepped into the role, and just kept working. He was killed at Endor when a rebel fighter crashed into the Executor's bridge. No grand last stand, just a competent bureaucrat of death catching a stray. But if Payette represents corruption through quiet professionalism, the next officer on this list went the complete opposite direction, screaming for recognition every step of the way. Director Orson Krennic. Orson Krennic built the most powerful weapon in galactic history and still couldn't get a single person to respect him, which is, not ideal. Here's the thing about Krennic. He didn't see the Death Star as a planet-killing superweapon. He saw it as a promotion. The entire project was a vehicle for personal vindication, a way to prove that engineering specialists deserved a seat at the table alongside the admirals and moffs who treated them like glorified maintenance crews. He resented the military hierarchy with every fiber of his being, and the Death Star was going to fix that. But instead of earning respect through the work, Krennic turned the whole thing into a personal crusade. He tracked down the Urso family, destroyed their settlement, and tried to force Galen's daughter Jyn into Imperial service. Full military force deployed for what was essentially a grudge. Hey, remember that scientist who ran away from me? Send in the Death Troopers. And the station itself was built on enslaved labor. Thousands of workers died during construction under conditions so brutal they were indefensible even by Imperial standards. Krennic didn't care. Every death was just a line item on the path to his name being remembered. It never was. Krennic died during the Battle of Scarif, vaporized by the very weapon he spent his entire career building. Barely anyone noticed. The man designed a monument to make himself unforgettable, and the galaxy forgot him anyway. But if Krennic's corruption was fueled by desperation for recognition, the next officer on our list needed no validation from anyone. She just wanted power, and she'd burn her own world to keep it. Governor Arinda Price. Price is the type of person who would burn her own house down if the insurance payout got her a bigger one. And that's not a metaphor. That's basically what she did. She combined genuine political intelligence with a level of psychopathic self-interest that made her one of the most dangerous governors in the entire empire. Not because she was powerful, because she was smart enough to make everyone else's power work for her. Here's where it gets genuinely chilling. Price didn't just manage the rebellion in her territory. She went after it with a ruthlessness that made even hardened Imperial officers uncomfortable. She personally ordered the destruction of an entire fuel depot on Lothal just to eliminate rebel operatives hiding there. Her own planet's critical infrastructure gone, because crushing the enemy mattered more than the people who depended on that fuel. Collateral damage wasn't a concern. It was a budget line she was happy to spend. Her own citizens paid the price for her escalations, and every single casualty was just a line item on her path to more control. That's not corruption in the traditional sense. That's something closer to clinical. But here's the kicker. The iron grip she spent years tightening around Lothal, it slipped at the worst possible moment. When the rebels launched their final liberation, Price ended up on a shuttle that went down after a struggle with Hera Syndulla. She died in the very chaos she'd helped create, on a world she'd brutalized into fighting back, which is, not ideal, but at least Price was confined to regional politics. The next officer on our list took Imperial overreach to an entirely different level, and he had a darksaber to back it up. Moff Gideon. Most Imperial officers had the decency to let their corruption die with the Empire. Gideon didn't get that memo. Operating well after the Empire's official collapse, he wasn't just clinging to old glory, he was building something new, something arguably worse. Here's the thing about Gideon. While other remnant commanders were hoarding Star Destroyers and playing pretend Emperor in the Outer Rim, he was running clandestine operations focused on one very specific goal, cracking the code on Force sensitivity. And his method for doing that involved the systematic abduction and experimentation on Force-sensitive individuals, including children. That's the detail that separates Gideon from every ambitious holdout officer refusing to accept a surrender. Stealing kids and strapping them to lab tables to extract whatever biological advantage they carried isn't military strategy. It's the work of a genuine monster wearing a cape. but he wasn't just playing mad scientist. Gideon adopted the dark saber, claimed it as his own symbol of authority, and attempted to fuse recovered Imperial military technology with Force user capabilities. The goal was unprecedented personal power, a one-man empire built on stolen genetics and ancient weapons. He wanted to become something the galaxy had never seen before, which is, not ideal for everyone else living in it. What makes Gideon uniquely dangerous is that his corruption outlived the institution that created it. The Empire died. His ambition didn't. He represents the nightmare scenario where Imperial ideology doesn't need an empire to survive. It just needs one sufficiently obsessed officer with resources and zero moral boundaries. But if Gideon proved that Imperial ambition could survive without the Empire, the next officer proved it could thrive with a fleet behind it. Admiral Natasi Dalla. The Empire blew up a planet and called it Tuesday. So when the Empire itself looks at one of its own officers and says, okay, you need to calm down, that person has achieved something truly special. Admiral Natasi Dalla was that person. Dalla clawed her way up through one of the most aggressively male-dominated military hierarchies in the galaxy, and the price of admission was simple: be more ruthless than every single man in the room. She paid that price and then some. Where other officers treated mass destruction as a necessary evil, Dalla treated it like a craft. Planetary annihilation wasn't a last resort for her. It was step one. She approached genocide with the cold detachment of someone solving a math problem, stripping away every humanizing element until all that remained was efficiency and body counts. Here's the thing, most Imperial officers drew a line at killing other Imperials. Dalla didn't. If destroying an allied fleet meant eliminating a political rival or advancing a strategic objective, she'd give the order without blinking. Other officers' forces weren't allies, they were resources, and resources get spent. Eventually, the Empire did what the Empire does when something becomes inconvenient. They stuck her in command of an isolated installation and essentially forgot about her. Too brutal to keep in the inner circle, too dangerous to formally punish. Just quietly shelved, like a weapon nobody wanted to admit they'd built. But here's the kicker. When the Empire collapsed, Dalla didn't collapse with it. She survived, regrouped, and attempted to rebuild Imperial authority from the ashes. Because for Dalla, ruthlessness was never a tool she picked up and put down. It was the entire philosophy, and philosophies don't retire. But if Dalla made the Empire uncomfortable from the inside, the next officer reshaped it from the top down. Grand Admiral Ray Sloan. Every officer we've talked about so far wanted something for themselves. Power, credit, survival, a bigger chair. Ray Sloan wanted something worse. She wanted to be right. Sloan's corruption wasn't personal. It was ideological. She genuinely believed Imperial principles represented the only viable governance capable of maintaining galactic order, not as a justification for advancement, not as an excuse for cruelty, but as a deeply held conviction she carried like a religious text. She looked at the New Republic and saw not liberation, but a galaxy sliding into chaos she was personally obligated to fix. That made her more dangerous than every self-serving opportunist on this list combined. Here's the thing about officers who are in it for themselves. You can buy them off. You can scare them. You can wait them out. Sloan couldn't be bought, couldn't be discouraged, and absolutely refused to quit. She built intelligence networks across Imperial remnant space, systematically eliminated resistance through overt military action and covert operations nobody ever knew happened. She was running a shadow empire while the New Republic was still figuring out committee assignments. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. When the opportunity arose to ally with dark side force users, Sloan took it without hesitation. A woman who claimed to believe in order, in rational governance, willingly embraced supernatural tyranny because it served her vision. That single decision revealed everything. Her commitment to order wasn't a principle, it was an obsession, and obsessions don't have boundaries. She kept trying to reconstruct Imperial authority well after the Empire was a smoking crater. The Empire died. Sloan's version of it just kept going. And if a true believer with zero quitner sounds bad, wait until you meet an officer who turned Imperial law enforcement into a personal weapon against his own family. Grand Provost Marshal Garrick Versio. Most of the officers on this list became corrupt through something recognizable. Ambition, ideology, desperation, ego. Garrick Versio became corrupt through professionalism. and that's what makes him genuinely unsettling. Versio internalized military efficiency so completely that human lives stopped being a moral consideration altogether. They were variables, inputs, and outputs. A population resisting imperial authority wasn't a political problem requiring nuance. It was an inefficiency requiring correction. And correction, in Versio's vocabulary, meant elimination. He ran Inferno Squad like a scalpel, demanding absolute operational perfection from everyone around him, including his own daughter. Personal attachments, moral hesitation, individual judgment, all of it was noise interfering with the mission. If the Emperor issued an order, you executed it, not because you agreed with it, because the system required compliance to function. Versio didn't question orders, he optimized their execution. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. When Operation Cinder came down and demanded the destruction of loyal Imperial worlds, Versio didn't flinch. He didn't push back, he didn't even pause. Burning entire planets that had faithfully served the Empire registered to him as standard protocol. Compassion looked like a lack of strategic vision. He wasn't suppressing his conscience, he just didn't have one to suppress. The machinery was running perfectly. There was no ghost left inside it, and that's exactly what killed him. Versio followed orders so faithfully, so completely, that he rode the Empire straight into the ground at the Battle of Jakku. Even when his own daughter defected, even when the cause was visibly collapsing around him, he couldn't deviate. A man who can't comprehend why people object to burning loyal worlds also can't comprehend when it's time to stop. His entire career is the corruption of excellence itself, mastery in a narrow domain, completely severed from any ethical framework. He didn't fall, he was simply operating as designed. But if Versio represents professionalism without a soul, the next officer represents something arguably worse. Brilliance without a conscience. Grand Admiral Thrawn. Most officers on this list wanted something. Power, recognition, survival, ideological victory. Thrawn wanted none of it. He wanted to win. Not for the Empire, not for himself, not for any cause you could name on a poster. He wanted to win because winning was the puzzle, and he was very, very good at puzzles. Here's what made Thrawn genuinely terrifying. He'd study your art, your music, your architecture. He'd sit there for hours analyzing the cultural output of an entire civilization, learning how your people think, what you fear, what you value, what breaks you, and then he'd use every single piece of that knowledge to destroy you with surgical precision. He didn't hate you. That's the worst part. He appreciated you. He found your culture genuinely fascinating, and then he wiped it out because the strategy demanded it. His campaigns had this almost intellectual quality to them. Every death served a purpose. Every sacrifice, including his own people, achieved some specific tactical outcome with zero wasted effort. Where Tarkin used a sledgehammer, Thrawn used a scalpel. He'd lose 100 soldiers to win a position that would cost the enemy 10,000 next week. The math always worked out. The math was always horrifying, and he had zero ideological commitment to any of it. The Empire was a vehicle. The Chiss ascendancy was a vehicle. Everything was infrastructure for the only thing he actually cared about, which was the elegant application of strategic force. Genius with no moral architecture, just pure cold optimization wearing an admiral's uniform. His potential survival is what keeps strategists up at night. A mind like that, unattached to any government or ideology, operating independently with whatever resources he can gather. That's not a military threat, that's an existential one. But if Thrawn perfected the art of destruction, the next officer turned it into official Imperial policy. Grand Moff Tarkin. Every officer on this list committed atrocities. Tarkin built the instruction manual. Tarkin wasn't just another corrupt Imperial climbing the ranks. He was a philosopher. The man developed an entire intellectual framework for why ruling through terror wasn't just effective but optimal. He genuinely believed the credible threat of planetary annihilation represented the pinnacle of strategic wisdom, peace through fear, order through the promise of absolute destruction. He didn't stumble into tyranny. He wrote the thesis paper on it, and then he proved it. The destruction of Alderaan wasn't rage or desperation, it was a demonstration. Tarkin ordered an entire planet erased to send a message to every other world in the galaxy: resist, and this happens to you. Billions of lives reduced to a talking point. which is, not ideal. But here's the thing, Alderaan wasn't an outlier. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent perfecting terror as governance. Every other officer on this list operated within a system Tarkin helped design. They were following rules he wrote, and his death? Perfect. He was aboard the Death Star when the rebellion fired that impossible shot, and he refused to evacuate. Not because he was brave, because his own philosophy wouldn't let him. Admitting the Death Star could fall meant admitting his entire worldview was wrong, so he stayed. And he died, killed by the very overconfidence his ideology required. But here's the kicker. Tarkin's real legacy was never the Death Star. It was the idea, the doctrine that terror equals peace. That idea outlived him, outlived the Empire. Every petty warlord, every remnant commander who believed enough firepower makes you. God was operating on Tarkin's playbook. You can blow up a battle station. You can't blow up an idea. He was the most corrupt officer the Empire ever produced. Not because he killed the most people, but because he convinced an entire galactic government that killing people was good policy. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.